So for reading, we've been talking a lot about the first day we talked about story elements for problem and solution, using focusing mostly just on problem and solution in stories. And then you focused on then we had the evaluate, and then we focused on how we were going to have story elements, or sorry, go over story elements using the different components that are most important. So we definitely know those. I would hope you would know those by now, because story elements are definitely something that you've been going over since kindergarten in stories. So it's the characters and the setting and the beginning, middle, and end, which is the plot, and it is the climax and the conflict and the problem. Those are all story elements. They're parts. An element is simply a piece of something. So story elements are what makes up a story. So this connects both to your narrative writing that you've been doing and the reading that we are working on. And part of that work is knowing how to fill out a story organizer, so that when you go to take a reading assessment, or when you go to answer questions about a text, you are able to answer questions better because you've thought so deeply about a story. I love this picture that I'm showing you on the screen here because it's important to remember that plot is definitely like a roller coaster. When I say plot, I'm talking about the beginning, middle, and end. I'm talking about fourth grade words, exposition, rising action, climax, the most exciting part of the story, then that falling action, and then the resolution, which is the end. So we've talked about those over and over and over again. So this picture is awesome because it's obviously of a roller coaster kind of park. And the important thing to remember about stories is that stories take place in lots of different ways. Sometimes stories are like this roller coaster here, and they get really exciting really fast, and then it takes a while for that solution to happen, or resolution, sorry, to happen. And there's a lot more falling action to it. So a story might start off kind of really close to that climax, get exciting and suspenseful really fast, and then it takes a while for that solution resolution to come to fruition. Then we have, this is what we call a classic story arc, this yellow one right here. And that classic story arc, I forgot I have some of these little drawing tools that I could be using. So that classic story, sorry, I don't know where my little tools went. So that's okay. So the classic story arc that is right here is where the story kind of starts off, normal. In the exposition of it, we start learning about the characters pretty steadily, and then things start happening, right? And they build up, and then boom, the most exciting the part of the story happens. The characters has their turning point, and then their falling action kind of slowly goes into place, and we have that resolution at the end. So this is a very classic storyline. This would be one that would probably go to with like most Disney movies, I would say. We have a buildup of our character, getting to know the character, climax, and then a slow resolution. This would be more of like when we watch a movie about probably actually like a horror movie or a mystery, or sometimes, oh, there's a movie. What is that? I used to watch it all the time. I can't think of it right now. It's it's got these mouse, it was like this mystery with these mice, and it's like the story starts off actually super suspenseful, like her dad is kidnapped and she's trying to get to the mouse that is like kind of like a Sherlock, and it's very suspenseful in the beginning, and then the resolution takes a while to come to the end. So that also is a story that kind of reminds me. I'm trying to think of another good one. And then we got this roller coaster back here, and this one's really interesting because this one, you can't really tell from this picture, but this is the kind of roller coaster that's a really old roller coaster, but it's really one of those ones that goes up and down and up and down and up and down. And so it's important to remember that sometimes we have stories that do this thing where they start off, you get to learn about the character, and then it's like really suspenseful for a long time. Like there's problem after problem, and the characters facing, and things are really difficult for a while. And then there's multiple climaxes, right? There's multiple times in the story where things are really exciting, and the stories and the characters kind of changing. And then the story starts to have its resolution. I would compare this more to like a chapter book because that's kind of what happens in chapter books a lot. Is there's multiple turning points, there's multiple times where the story gets exciting, and so that's what that reminds me of. And then you see some of these smaller ones back here, and these kind of remind me of what you don't want in a story. Like this guy right here, he's kind of just going, and they kind of remind me of like stories that don't ever have anything really exciting happening, and they're just flatlining basically all the time. They're just kind of these little kid roller coasters, and it kind of reminds me of the thought that some of you are writing stories that are just, just that. They're just stories that aren't really that interesting to read. They don't have a lot of suspense in them. They don't have that turning point for your character, and that's not what we're looking for here. So, that's one reason why I love this image. It's a really cool image to kind of display the fact that it's okay for you to have different stories. You don't have to have this perfect arc, but you definitely, just like these roller coasters, you need to have an arc to make it exciting and good and deep. All right, so let's talk about those words that I keep using. And I've used them in our narrative writing, I've used them in reading. So I'm going to continue using them because I really want you to transition from using the words beginning, middle, and end, to these words instead. So this is an exposition. And an exposition is the beginning of the story. The characters and setting are introduced, and the conflict may also be introduced. That's that roller coaster right there. So the conflict is already kind of starting in the beginning of the story. Um, so I love this because it makes it very clear. So I would really think about this. If you have a reading journal at home, you could pause the video and actually write this down. That way you have it so that when I talk about exposition, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But definitely the characters and setting are included in that. If you don't have your introduction, or sorry, when you're reading your stories, you should be able to find who the characters are in the setting for the most part, in the beginning of the story. Then we have what I keep saying is the rising action. This is a series of relevant events. So, relevant means events that have to do with the actual story. And it's a series of them, which means that it's more than one action or event that creates suspense and interest and tension in a narrative. And these events lead up to the climax. There's that word narrative again, just like in writing. This is reading, but it's going to kind of mesh together here. Narrative is just a fancy word for a story. And these events lead up to the climax. And the climax is a decisive moment or a turning point in a storyline at which the conflict hits the highest point. It's often the most exciting part of the story. So it's definitely, where does the story change? When does the character just change their course of action? So when do they change their mood? When do they change their feelings? How they're acting and why they're acting that way? That's the climax. Then we have, once we've hit that climax, we have the falling action. And this is where the events in the plot following the climax, but they're before the end. Okay, so they lead you to that satisfying ending. They lead you to you don't want to ever go from just this super exciting story to the end of the story. You need to fill in those gaps of like, how did you get from the exciting part of the story to the ending? It'd be kind of like if you were watching a movie, say, like, especially like a Marvel movie, right? And you're in the fight scene and there's this big moment, right? And then it cuts to the end and they're all at Iron Man's funeral. Okay. So you don't know what happened or how you got there or what's going on. You have no idea. And so it's really, really important for you to have those events that lead up until the very end, even if it's the most exciting part of the story. And you think, oh, that's the part that's wrapping it all up. That's not the wrap. The climax is the turn point in the story. If your climax is the ending of your story, that means that you're not, that you need to go back and look at that again. So when you're reading, you're never going to read a story that ends with the most exciting part. And if that's the case, then they probably have another part of the story coming. And then we have our resolution, and this is where loose ends are tied up. The conflict is solved, outcomes are revealed, and a happy or sad ending takes place. And then the last thing, I don't know why we always put this at the end, but it's more goes with the middle, I would say, or within the climax generally. But the conflict is the main problem in the story. It's a struggle between two opposing forces, and usually this means like two people. But sometimes stories, just like is they're about it's might be like made up animals or made up other characters in the story. But it's basically usually what is the problem between two opposing forces. All right. So that is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about those words. And like I said, what you could do while you're watching this video is pause it each time I talk about each one of these and write them down. I also am going to put this on to link this onto the slide, the Explore slide for today. So you'll have access to this. If your parents have a printer at home, you can print it off. If not, you can pull it up and use it and save it on your computer, and then you'll have it available to you so you know what I'm talking about when I talk about each part of the story. So for your assignment today, you're going to be looking at, sorry, I'm looking right now. You're going to be looking at a story and actually labeling parts of the story that are the exposition, the rising action. So you will need to label those parts based on the story that you are given to read, and then the parts will be there for you, and you have to label what each part is. All right. Well, thank you for listening all the way to the end, and hopefully this helped make some of those plot words or vocabulary make a little bit more sense. Have fun reading the story and figuring out that roller coaster.